Hey peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is part 2 of the McCalls 8009 sew along. So today we will be creating the bodice. So let's get started. Before we get started, you want to make sure that you've snipped in all your notches and marked all of the markings that will help you put the item together. So these are the gather points and the back bodice piece, which will help us work out how much we need to gather the front section down by. So I have put my pin through the gather point and I just fold the fabric back and make a mark with my friction pen at the point that the pin has gone through, and I'm going to do that for both layers because I've got the outer and the lining fabric here. I'm going to do the same for both of these. I'm also going to mark in the large triangle. That'll help us match up the shoulder seams. I'm not putting in my sleeves to this one, so I won't need to mark this one in. And then I also have the dart, so I snip into the bottom legs of the dart the same manner that I do with my notches. And then I'll put a pin through here, peel back the fabric, mark this with my friction pen where the pin has gone through the fabric, and then I will join up the legs of the dart with the notches that I made at the ends with my ruler. So I'm going to do that for the back piece. I also need to mark in all the gathering points on the midriff panel and the front section as well. So I'm not using a sheer fabric, so I won't need to be underlining my outer fabric. So I'm going to move on to the beginning steps of the sew along. So the first thing it wants us to do is gather shoulder edge of bodice front between small circles. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm also going to sew in the darts to the back, and I've just showed you how I've marked my darts. I've done the same with marking the points for gathering, so I'm going to get all of that done. Okay, so I've pinned my dart and I have made sure that the pins are going through the legs of the darts on both sides. I'm going to back stitch at the end of the dart, and then I'm going to sew off of the end of the dart, just because you don't want to back stitch up here because you end up with pointy ends. So I'm going to sew off of the end, and then I'm going to tie that in a knot to finish off the end of the dart. Okay, so my dart is sewn. I just need to finish off the end, and I'm going to do that, as I said, by just tying the threads in a knot. This should give you a nice smooth finish to the end of your dart. I'm going to trim off the excess, and that's the dart finished. You're going to want to press those towards the centre, so I'm going to do that for all of them. The pattern doesn't mention this, but I have actually just stay stitched the front edge of my neckline, or the front edge of my front bodice pieces, just because it is kind of cut with some bias in there, so I want to make sure that this doesn't pull out of shape whilst I am putting the outfit together, putting the garment together. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to run gathering stitches. So on the upper shoulder, I like to run my gathering stitching 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, and then I do another line of stitching 3/8 of an inch away from that, which does mean the actual seam line is in between those gathering stitches. When you're doing this, you want to make sure on a scrap piece of fabric that your fabric will recover from having holes in it, because otherwise there will be visible holes in the garment, because as I say, we're stitching both sides of the actual seam line. I have sewn my 2 lines of gathering stitches, as I say, 3/8 of an inch away from the edge and 3/8 of an inch away from that, so the stitching line is actually in between there. I find that gives me the nicest gathers, but it does mean that you will have holes in your fabric, so you need to make sure that your fabric recovers well from that. If it doesn't, do your 2 lines of gathering stitches within your seam allowance. The other thing I wanted to let you know as well is this is my lining fabric. When I bought this, there were some small marks, as you can see here. This was from the Textile Centre at the Knitting and Stitching Show. I got the last of the bolt, and I got the last sort of 75 centimetres for free because there were some little brown marks on it. So I'm using this as my lining, and I've put a pin in all of my lining pieces because I'm using the same fabric for the lining as I am for the outer, and I want to be able to distinguish between the two easily. So I put a pin in all of my lining pieces so that I can identify them quickly. Okay, so now that we've got our gathering stitches in, we are going to sew up the shoulder seams. So we're going to match up the notches and the gather points, and then pull the gathering nicely and stitch at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so I have matched up the points for the gathering. I've matched up the notch, and the same this side, so the gather point and the gather point here. And now I'm going to pull my gathering stitches to distribute the fullness, hopefully fairly evenly, along this front section. So once you're happy with how that's distributed, you want to pin it into place, and then you can do the same on the other side. Okay, so you want to sew with the gather side up so that you can make sure that this is all behaving itself. Once you've sewn at 5/8 of an inch, you then want to take out the lines of gathering. Now all of the other ones have come out really easily, and of course this one gets stuck. All of the other ones came out incredibly easily. So you just want to, if it does get stuck like that, you just want to unpick. I think I might have just sewn over something. There we go, yeah. There we go, so I've removed all the gathering stitches. Now we are going to go to the ironing board and we are going to press this towards the back, and we're also going to press our dart towards the centre. And the pattern says to prepare the bodice lining in the same way as the front, but I have been doing all of that at the same time, and I have put a note to say that you should be doing all of that for the lining and the outer at the same time, just so that you don't have to repeat all those processes again. Get them all done in batches. So the next thing that we need to do is number 6, which is with right sides together, pin lining to bodice, stitch neck edge, trim understitched lining. So we're going to sew the front edge together and the back neck edge. We are going to leave it a little bit open so we can fit a zipper in there later, but I will show you what I mean when we get to it. This is where our pinned pieces come in nice and handy to make sure that we've got our lining attached to our outer rather than 2 linings and 2 outers being put together. So we're going to sew from the back neck edge right down to the front edge here at 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to pin that in place and I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. Okay, so I have sewn the back neck edge and the front edge together at 5/8 of an inch. Because of the way I want to put my zip in, I have actually left a gap between here and here, so this edge is free so that I can sandwich my zip between these two later once the trousers are on. So the next step is to understitch the seam allowance to the lining, which again I have got marked with my pins so I know which is which. You want to, if you're following along with me, you want to finish your understitching around about here so that you can easily get in and finish this line of stitching once your zip is in, and then you can finish your understitching. So you want to finish your understitching around about 1 inch away from this line of stitching here. Okay, so I have understitched my seam allowance to my lining piece. Understitching is exactly that. You want to make sure that all of the seam allowance is going to stay on the inside of the garment. This will help it do that. So I like to understitch before I press and before I trim. So I have understitched, I am now going to trim. I'm going to clip in the curves around the neckline, and then I'm going to go and press. So I've clipped into the curves around the neckline, so I'm going to go and press this so that the lining side is face up, and the understitching that we've done will help us to roll and make sure that the lining stays on the inside. Can you see there? You can just see the outer fabric poking out, and that's naturally how it wants to sit. So I'm going to press it from the lining side up so I can make sure I get a nice even sort of edge of the outer fabric showing. Everything is pressed and I have a nice crisp front edge. So I'm actually going to deviate from the pattern now because this is me, and of course I am. I'm going to finish my armholes now because if I leave it sleeveless like I would like to, it wants me to finish it with bias binding later on in the process, and I think I can finish it by machine now, which will mean that I won't have to do that. So I'm going to attempt that. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so I have turned it so that we have the right sides together, and I have lined up the shoulder seam and the edges. This is the side seam here, and I'm going to sew around a 5/8 of an inch. At the beginning I have it level, but then I offset the lining by about 1/8 of an inch, and that's going to help the lining to roll to the inside of the garment. And so I do it all the way around here, and then again I have this edge flush, and then just start offsetting it by 1/8 of an inch, kind of a couple of inches in. So I'm going to sew that at 5/8 of an inch the whole way around. I have sewn my sleeve together and now I need to clip into the curves. I'm going to need to clip it so that I can release all the tension around here, that it will lie nice and flat. So I'm going to do that and then we can turn these through. Okay, so once you've clipped your curves, you want to reach in between and you want to pull one piece. Just be careful if you've got any pins in there like I have. Pull it through. And then we've got our armholes finished. I'm going to take this to the ironing board and again I'm going to press it from the lining side up and just try and roll it so that we have a little bit of the outside fabric showing, and I'm going to press that the whole way around the armhole. Okay, so once you have the armholes sewn, you want to then run your basting stitches along the bottom edge of your front bodice. This will baste the two edges together. So once you've done that, we are then going to pin with right sides together, pin midriff front to lower edge of bodice fronts, adjust, gathers and baste. I'm actually going to do this one section at a time. So I'm going to pin my centre front to my centre front, adjust all the gathers, baste that into place, and then I'm going to do the other side and then we can sew on our lining piece. So as I mentioned, I've sewn this in 2 passes and there is a centre front large circle that matches up with the large circles that you have matched on your front pieces. And I've sewn in one piece at a time and backstitched at the large circle. So when you turn this over to the front, you should end up with something that looks like this, and I'm very happy with that. So the next thing I'm going to do is pin my midriff lining right sides to the wrong sides of the bodice piece here. So this is the lining piece, and then you can see there's the wrong side of the midriff. So we're going to basically make a bodice sandwich, and I'm going to do the same thing because if I try to pivot at this point and then continue sewing, there's a lot of bulk in here that we need to manipulate around. So I'm going to pin this into place and start stitching at one edge, back stitch here, raise my work up, move everything around underneath so that it's lying flat, and then do the other side. And I'm going to stitch that in at 5/8 of an inch. I'm also sewing this with my previous line of stitching facing up, so I can use that as a guide to make sure that I get the same line of stitching in there and there isn't any stitching visible on the right side of the garment. We need to trim the excess bulk away from this centre point, and we also need to remove our gathering stitches. But before you do any of that, fold it out and double check that you're happy with how everything is lying. I am. So I am going to go back in and I'm going to trim out all of this bulk here, which will make that much easier to press flat, and then I'm going to remove my gathering stitches. When you're sewing your midriff panel on, you want to stop around about 2 inches away from the side edge of the garment. As you can see, I didn't do this and I've had to unpick it. So I have secured the stitching here, and we want to do this so that we can sew the side seams up with a nice clean finish. So once you have finished putting your midriff panels together, you're then going to separate them out. So you should have 4 layers of fabric here. So you're going to separate this out so that you have 2 sets of 2 layers of fabric that should be right sides together. And you can see the stitches that I've used to secure the midriff panel there. So what we're going to do is we're then going to sew these together separately. So we have the lining and we have the outer. So I'm going to fold the lining out of the way, I'm going to back stitch here, and I'm going to stitch this to the edge and back stitch here, and then I'm going to repeat that process for this side, and that will just mean that we can get the lining and the outer together to sew the side seams up cleanly. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, so once you have sewn those 2 pieces independently, you should end up with something that looks like this. So this is our underarm seam here, this is our midriff seam here and here, lining and outer. I genuinely don't know if that's the right way around, but it doesn't really matter. What you want to make sure is that you don't catch this fabric with your stitching and sew it back like that. You don't want to do that. So you want to make sure that it's going to lie nice and flatly. So the next thing that we need to do is finish off our armhole. So It is a little bit fiddly, but this is the lengths I will go to avoid having to sew bias binding onto my armholes, and you all know how much I like bias binding. So we've got the finished edge of our armhole here, and these are our 2 underarm seams. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those and we are going to nest the seam allowances, and that means that we're going to have one set of seam allowances that way and one set of seam allowances that way, and that way you don't end up with too much bulk, and you should get your joins to be nicely nested. This is a trick that I learnt from quilting. So I'm going to pin that into place, and whichever way the seam is going to be going under the presser foot, so I'm going to be sewing it this way, I'm pinning that seam allowance down in place as well. Feel free to pin this seam allowance into place as well. So we're matching up our raw edges, and this is a little bit fiddly because you haven't got a lot of space to work in, but what we're going to do is we're going to match up our double notches. We're going to match up the bottom edge, and then we're just going to pin the rest of this seam into place, and then we're just going to work our way around and do the lining, or the other side of the underarm as well, because we've gone from the underarm up here down to the hem, the waistline, and we're going to do the same for the other side. So we just want to make sure that everything matches up nicely. Don't poke yourself with the pin. I'm trying to do this through the viewfinder and over the top of the camera, and clearly failing miserably. Right, so we've got everything matched up. I'm going to put another pin in here just to make sure, but we've got all the raw edges matched up nicely from the waistline to the underarm. Now we're going to do the same with the other side, and this is where I'm saying it's getting a little bit tricky, but it is doable. I have done it, don't worry. So we're doing exactly the same thing. We've already got our underarm matched up there. I'm going to match up our double notches. Going to match up our waistline. And because we've got about 2 inches of room, there is wiggle room in here. It does fit under the presser foot. I have tried this, I've done this on the other side, and it worked perfectly. So this will just cleanly finish the side seams, the armholes, and that will also mean that we can press up the seam allowance on our lining so that we can also enclose the zip and the raw edge of our waistband once that's all sewn in. Because if we went by the pattern, we would have the zip would be visible, the zipper tape would be visible on the inside of the garment, which can be scratchy. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but it can be scratchy. I prefer to not have it there. And it also meant that the waist seam would have needed to be finished with bias binding or overlocking, and again this way we can just fold up the raw edge of our lining fabric, and we can either slip stitch or stitch in the ditch that into place. So you should end up with something that looks like this. So what we're going to do is take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to start at one waistline, and we're going to sew at 5/8 of an inch the whole way around. It does fit under. You just take it slowly and manipulate the fabric as you go. And again, this is just the length that I will go to avoid having to sew bias binding onto an armhole. I mean, I like it as a finish, it's just not my favourite. This is my favourite way of finishing armholes, and if I can do it, then I will. And I can with this one. So you just want to make sure everything's lying nice and flatly. When we come to the midriff seam, make sure that's lying flatly under the presser foot. 5/8 of an inch the whole way around. Okay, and you don't need to worry about what the needle's doing. I'm looking at the guide on the side of my presser foot. Wonder if I can put you guys, here we go, slightly better view this side, although you are kind of in the way, but that's fine, I'll forgive you. Okay. So you just want to kind of feel as you go. You'll be able to feel if there's any bumps or lumps under your presser foot and from the wrong side or from the underside of the fabric that you can't see. You can feel if there's bumps. So again, we've got to our underarm seam here. I've nested the seam allowances. Just going to make sure that that stays under the presser foot. And I'm using the guides, as I mentioned, on my stitch plate. The needle's going to do the same thing all the time, so you don't need to watch the needle. What you need to do is make sure that you're maintaining your seam allowance. This is, I say, is 5/8 of an inch. So, like I say, a little bit tricky, but completely doable. It's not the trickiest part of this pattern. I would say that was getting the midriff point to meet up well with the bodice, which we have already done. And as I say, with that one, I do one side at a time. That's my trick for that. Okay. Moving that all round. Again, just making sure everything is lying nice and flat. Don't sew over your pins. Unless you're like Bianca and have made a deal with your sewing machine and the pins for your firstborn. I mean, I could do that deal as well. I have zero intention of ever having kids, so it's a bit hard on your sewing machine though, isn't it? Right, so there we go. We're around to the other side. Back stitch. Move you guys back around here. So what this has done is given us a nicely finished side seam with a nicely finished underarm. So you can see there. So the thing that you have now is you do have a free floating piece of your midriff here, but it is attached up until about two inches away. As I said, you can totally tack that into place if you want to. I'm not going to worry about it. I don't think that that's going to cause me a problem later on. So I'm going to take this to the ironing board. This is my right side, so I'm going to press these seams open. Again, this is going to be a little bit fiddly, but totally doable. I am then going to press the bottom edge of my lining up by 5/8 of an inch so that I can finish this cleanly once I have attached the trousers. I'm going to press my side seams open. Will be a little bit fiddly, but totally doable. And that way we have a nicely finished side seam and underarm, which I am very, very pleased about. I was a little bit worried at one point that I wasn't going to get this finished, but I have, and I am happy. So yes, pressing next, and then this is quite a good point to try on your bodice and see if you're happy with the fit. If you have somebody that can help pin the back together for you at the seam allowance, this is a good time to check the fit, because if you need to, you can unpick the side seams and either let them out or sew them a little bit tighter. So yeah, this is a good time to check fit. If you are new to this pattern, I would suggest making a muslin, unlike me, but you know, I like to live dangerously, so I am actually going to press this and try it on. Okay, so I have pressed my side seams nice and flatly. I've also pressed up the raw edge of the waistline on the lining so that I can sew that in to I slip stitch that into place later. This is very low cut, very, very low cut. I am thinking that I might do this version and then I might see if I can just raise up this center point by about 1.5 inches, not a lot, but my balconette bra is completely on show with this. The other thing I'm thinking about is maybe having a look for kind of like a lacy vest top that I can wear underneath it, but this kind of jumpsuit is for hot summery months, so I have a feeling that this one is going to be worn with a plunge bra. It looks really nice, it really does, but it is very low cut, very, very low cut, which, you know, that is how it's designed, so it's not really a surprise. But yeah, I have a feeling that I might want to just raise up this part for a future one, which I will do. So I'm going to finish this one. I'm going to get the trousers done. That is the next step. As ever, if you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!